Bass, President of National Council of Jewish Women of Australia, Victoria, and I wish to extend a very warm welcome to members of the Fink family and guests and members of National Council to the 2019 lecture to honour Mina Fink of blessed memory, a former President of National Council in Victoria in 1957 and President of our national organisation from 1967 to 1973. Mina's daughter Frida Freiberg and Mina's son Nathan Fink and members of their families are in attendance tonight, and I'd like to thank them for their continuing support of this annual lecture and also for supporting the work of National Council. Normally, we ask our keynote speakers to craft their address around the key themes of Mina's life: women, education, and Israel. But tonight, we have chosen to showcase the life and legacy of Mina herself, and in telling her story, help to shine a light on the role of women in history. Mina was a visionary and a feminist before feminism was mainstream. She was greatly influenced by the women's movement in the United States. On becoming president of the National Organisation of National Council, Mina was one of the first leaders to incorporate the US women's movement agenda into the work of National Council across Australia. I'm sure she would be very pleased to know that a few months ago, CEO Leanne Basser and board members Hannah Greenberg, Anne Wallner and myself visited our colleagues in America and participated in their advocacy work in Washington, DC, and that National Council today is continuing the direction she began so long ago. Sheila. We are proud and delighted to have two very accomplished and well-recognised speakers to present this evening. I would like to acknowledge and thank our CEO Leanne Basser for initiating and organising tonight's speakers. Firstly, to set the context for this evening, our first speaker, Rebecca Davis, features editor and news journalist at the Australian Jewish News, will tell us why women have so often and for so long had their contributions to history unrecognised and why it's important to tell their stories. Our keynote speaker, Dr Margaret Taft, otherwise known as Margie, research associate at the Australian Centre for Jewish Civilization at Monash University, author, researcher, teacher and lecturer, will then tell the story of how Mina Fink rose to leadership positions in 3 major Jewish organisations, imparting a distinctive leadership culture that still shapes and defines these organisations today. There will then be an opportunity for Q&A. I would like to now introduce Rebecca Davis to begin the 2019 National Council Mina Fink Lecture. Rebecca, as I have already said, is features editor and a news journalist at the Australian Jewish News and reports on international, national, state and local stories. With a love for storytelling, Rebecca is passionate about sharing stories that move, inspire or evoke thought. She has interviewed a range of personalities, from political and business leaders to fashion designers, innovators to medical pioneers, and Holocaust survivors to Hollywood stars. Rebecca graduated with a Bachelor of Arts majoring in English Literature and History and honours in History. Her thesis was exploration of how communism impacted post-Soviet Jewish identity and included an oral history of post-Soviet Jews from Melbourne, Australia. Rebecca has a special interest in the latest happenings in Israel and the Jewish world, stories of conflict and coexistence between Israelis and Palestinians, Jewish food, Jewish history, food. Jewish food or just food? Always, just general food and fashion. I give you Rebecca Davis.
Thank you for the very warm welcome, Miriam. Okay, history is not the past, it's the record of what's left on the record. It was Hilary Mantel, the Man Booker Prize-winning English writer, who penned these words, who implores us to deploy the same reserves of consideration for those who write the stories of history as the history itself. Indeed, the stories confined to the annals of history say as much about the historical figure or event as the person who wrote it. The way in which we view the world is inevitably shaped by our personal perspectives, coloured by our experiences and our biases. These factors are inextricably bound to not just how we understand and interpret, but what information we, as individuals and as a society, deem to be important and what we do not. According to the English historian and author, Dr Bettany Hughes, while women have always been 50% of the population, they only occupy around 0.5% of recorded history. Ladies and gentlemen, it seems fitting then that this evening, as we celebrate the great achievements and life of Mina Fink, a woman who wowed, that we also pause to reflect upon the broader context of women in history. It's a moment to consider why Mina and so many other remarkable women of our local and global histories have been largely denied their pages in the canon or had their accomplishments relegated to the shadows. We examine the impact of these omissions and how we can reclaim our women and their stories to positively affect our futures. They're just stories. What do they matter though? As a features editor and a news journalist at the Australian Jewish News, I'm at times met with this derision expressed by others. Stories are my everyday, and they're the reason I don't sleep most Tuesday nights because the paper goes to print on a Wednesday morning. And long before the AJN, stories were my education. As Miriam mentioned, I was an English literature and history major before going on to write my honours thesis in history. Stories are my life, and they're yours too. Perhaps more than you actually realise. They are more than this week's newspaper or a university assignment gathering dust. They are the stories of us, the cornerstones of how we construct our identity. As Jews, we know this too well. We read the Megillah to remember Purim, the Haggadah to recall our struggle in Egypt, and each Shabbos we read another Parsha. The Torah is not just our oral law. It's our story, the story of the Jewish people through elation and exile, preserved and shared from generation to generation. It keeps us rooted in our past so that we can flourish into a future. But imagine if we didn't have it. What would Jewish identity look like without being anchored by a story, by our story? In her book, Modern Women's History, a Historiography, historian Professor Karen Sayer wrote, "The history of women has been obscured, hidden and lost because no one had taken an interest. No one had recorded it. It was not written. Women were not, it had been believed, the legitimate subjects of history. Because, Sayer writes, the prevalent view had been that historians should only be concerned with change and with major political and economic movements, while women, if they conformed to their ascribed feminine roles, did not play a decisive role in such processes." But this was not always the case. In fact, when we venture way back to prehistory, we see the antithesis to this modern construct of the place of women. Who here has visited the Israel Museum? Yeah. Walking through the artefacts, what do you notice about the figurines from the late Stone Age through the Neolithic and early Bronze Age? Many of those are of women. Indeed, women form around 90% of figurines between the period around 40,000 BCE and 5,000 BCE. But then, as prehistory clicks over into history, our girls largely tend to disappear. So what happened? Dr. Hughes comments, "At the birth of civilised society, you have these very productive and sophisticated settlements with women having great status. They are high priestesses, they have property rights and own land, they write poetry. But these new civilisations want to expand. A celebration of femininity does not fire up a civilisation on burgeoning expansion. And as society became more militarised, the balance of power shifted. Consider the arrival of powerful warrior gods in archaeology and literature, the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Iliad and the Odyssey, narratives which are representative of the gear change in how we are told the story of humanity," says Dr. Hughes. This becomes the new norm. Whereas previously a measure of achievement might have been the physical survival of the community and of quality of life, it is now expansion and success. Women's roles remain diminished. And they do so for quite a while, until the 1970s, when new feminist historians began retrieving women from beneath the cloak of invisibility. Up until this point, history had largely been written about men or men's interests, or rather, that it had been bounded by dominant constructions of masculinity and rooted in what has since come to be called separate spheres ideology. Those who wrote the history decided what was significant and what the legitimate objects and subjects of study should be. As it was largely white, middle-class men who were recognised historians, leaving aside the past as represented outside of the academy, women were as a consequence excluded from history. Of course there are exceptions. Brilliant women of sass and strength who are documented challenge the status quo. The Greeks' Athena, Saraswati in the Hindu tradition, Seshat from ancient Egypt, and of course our matriarchs and movers and shakers, Esther, who led her people to freedom, and Deborah, the prophetess and judge. But other women are portrayed as overtly sexualised seductresses. Think Cleopatra or Helen of Troy, Eve or Mary Magdalene. Comparatively, overall, the stories of women are relegated to the margins, deemed unfit for a lead role in the narrative. The margins are a place where I like to play. As a historian, we're taught to look there. Whose story has not been told? Why is that? Who has been telling the story, and what can you contribute to the historiography? In this age of democratic history, oral history is the great equaliser, giving voices to those who previously lacked the literacy to tell their story, those denied access to education because of their socio-economic status, skin colour, religion, gender or sexual orientation. Now, more than ever before, barriers are being broken down, but still some remain, with dominant narratives still monopolising the historical landscape and drowning out other stories. Take the Melbourne Jewish community, for example, where the post-war Polish experience is the popularised and preeminent account dictating the historical discourse. Yes, it is a huge part of the collective identity of our community, home to the largest number of Holocaust survivors per capita anywhere outside of Israel in the world. But by focusing too narrowly on one narrative, inherently marginalises others. I examined this further in my honours thesis, which investigated why our post-Soviet Jews, the largest immigrant-born group in our Jewish community, are seldom represented in our public spaces, Jewish museums, the curriculum of our Jewish schools, local historical narratives and communal newspapers. Similarly, as a journalist, I'm always looking for stories on the periphery. Earlier this year, I wrote a feature article about Abby Stein, the first openly transgender woman raised in the Hasidic community. Born in Brooklyn's Vishnetz sect, the only books that Abby was exposed to were strictly moderated religious texts. She recalled that as a child, she felt a profound uncomfortability in her identity. Yet, she was bereft of the tools, vocabulary, and language required to even remotely describe or understand her inner turmoil, and was isolated from the knowledge to support to address it. Because of the parameters of such a heavily cloistered community, the idea of homosexuality is almost unknown, and the concept of gender identity is completely unheard of, told Abby. She goes on to detail her struggle in breaking free and coming to understand her own identity. Abby's example illustrates the challenges of not having access to a similar experience as a point of reference shared in the public space. Her story further underscores the important role of a newspaper to include the stories that have the potential to reach individuals, to enlighten, inform, educate, normalise. Imagine the impact of reading Abby's stories for a teenager who is undergoing a similar internal struggle now. Suddenly, they're a little less alone and a little less isolated. Abby's story is just one which highlights the importance of sharing the less popular stories. Annette Matov is another example. In a feature last year, she courageously shared her very personal story of losing her sister to suicide. Then there was Dana Pinchasov, who told me about the day a suicide bomber boarded her bus, the severe injury she incurred, and her road to survival. Rita Migdal shared with me about losing her family in the Holocaust to only find herself on the harrowing voyage aboard the infamous Exodus. Ros Ben Moshe spoke on how she got through bowel cancer with laughter and mindfulness. And a woman, who we'll call Rachel, choked back tears as she recounted the years of domestic violence and sexual abuse she experienced at the hands of her then husband. These are all stories of women in the Jewish community, powerful, inspiring, sad, triumphant. And the act of telling their stories allows for the breaking of stereotypes, taboos, and instead gives visibility and power. It is a proud owning and assertion of identity. Tayyiba Taylor is the founder and editor-in-chief of Aziza, the first ever magazine to focus on Muslim American women's perspectives and experiences. She said, "We can either allow others to tell our stories, or we can tell our stories ourselves." Yes, we can. As journalists, historians, community organisations and corporations, as mothers and daughters and fathers and sons, through the telling the stories of our women to our family, friends, colleagues, and anyone who will listen. And Dr Margaret Taft is one woman telling our stories, working tirelessly to ensure that our women are included in history. Dr Taft is a research associate at the Australian Centre for Jewish Civilization at Monash University, a published author, experienced researcher, teacher, and lecturer. Her interests lie in the Jewish immigrant experience and the reconstruction of life in the post-war period, and her publications include The Emergence and Development of the Holocaust Witness, 1941 to 1949, a co-authored biography of Walter Lippmann, and more recently, A Second Chance, The Making of Jewish Melbourne. She's currently working on a biography of Leo and Mina Fink, and tonight she speaks about Mina. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr Margaret Taft.
Well, esteemed members of the National Council of Jewish Women, to the wonderful extended Fink family here today, thank you for entrusting me with the honour of delivering this year's Mina Fink Lecture. To my family that are here, my colleagues that I can see over there, and many friends, thank you for putting up with me and your enduring support. This evening, we are here to celebrate, to recognise, but to better understand the life and legacy of Mina Fink, who first rose to prominence in the early 1940s as a formidable community leader, an organiser, and a prodigious fundraiser at a time when few Jewish women had the opportunity to lead and command within organisations that were led by men, and even fewer took up the challenge to do so. By the time of her passing on the 2nd of May 1990 at the age of 77, Mina Fink, MBE, Member of the British Empire, had left her indelible mark on 3 thriving Jewish institutions: Jewish welfare, known as Jewish Care, the National Council of Jewish Women, both at state and federal levels, and the Holocaust Centre in Melbourne. All of these institutions remain with us today, bigger and better than ever before, and a cursory glance around their walls and through their corridors reveals the towering and enduring presence of the name Fink. But Mina's impact went beyond the institutional level, often reaching out to individuals and championing personal causes that touched her deeply. Whether it was an unmarked grave of a man unknown to her that she noticed on passing at Springvale Cemetery and successfully lobbied to be given a tombstone, or the care and commitment that she showed towards a group of Holocaust orphans known as the Buchenwald Boys, who arrived in the late 1940s and who would share a bond with her until she died, finding them Jewish homes to live in, jobs, encouraging them to obtain qualifications, also being an Unterführer at their weddings, or while under the patronage of the National Council, personally undertaking the guiding and publication of a Holocaust survivor's memoir, The Lodge Ghetto Orphanage Teacher, Sheva Glass-Wiener. Mina undertook every project, big or small, as a personal mission with drive and energy. Impeccable organisational skills. A mind like a computer, I was told, in a pre-computer age. Exceptional networking, as Danielle Charik told me, who's unfortunately not with us here today, she's in Italy. She pulled people in and she pulled them along with her, was a trait that I was told many times. And a leadership style that encouraged teamwork and team growth. United we stand and divided we fall, she proclaimed as National Council of Jewish Women State President in her 1958 annual report. It was a mantra that was characteristic of Mina Fink's lectureship style. Now, as a list of achievements, this is very impressive. Much of it's known, but of greater interest really is the big question. Why? What drove her to do this? And while Mina enjoyed a comfortable and cultured life within the relative security of Melbourne, she chose to make a difference to the lives of others. Or I could argue that life and circumstance chose Mina. She did the rest. In searching for answers and to better understand her life and legacy, we need to enter the world that Mina was born into, the world she inhabited, and the forces that shaped and defined her life as a woman who took her place as an equal amongst men, and as a leader of other women, as a loving wife, a devoted mother, a devoted and loving grandmother, and a loyal friend, because things don't happen in a vacuum. Mina belonged to a particular generation of Eastern European immigrant Jews, what I call, for want of a better term, the intersection generation, of the early to mid-20th century, one that straddled the old and the new, who emigrated from the shtetls and cities of the old Jewish world to embrace a new life in the new world of Melbourne, Australia, at a particularly critical time for Jewish life in that century, when Jewish survival in the old world was precarious, imperilled, and ultimately came under threat of annihilation during the Holocaust. It was also a Jewish world that was uplifted by the rebirth and renewal of Jewish life in a modern Jewish state, Israel. At one end of the spectrum, there was horrific loss and catastrophe, and at the other end, the hope of redemption, all of which occurred within the space of a few tumultuous years. I think what set this intersection generation, of which Mina was a critical part, was a tight and shared organic bond that they had with the Jewish world and with Jewish humanity. For this generation, men and women alike, there was no distance, no break, and no separation between their lives and the lives of others. For Jews of Mina's generation, whether they lived in Melbourne or New York or Warsaw or Paris, events that impacted on Jewish life in any corner of the Jewish world affected them deeply. It was personal. Their response to Jewish crises within their own community or in cities abroad or within their own family, living here or over there, was a call to action. The imperative was to be involved in the solution. And in this regard, Mina and her husband Leo epitomised that nexus between the life they had lived in that old world, the life skills they had honed there, the imperatives of that world that never left them, and the opportunities that were offered and seized upon in the new, free and open world. For Mina, the people of Mina's generation never forgot who they were or where they came from. They shared a cultural DNA. But some exceptional individuals, like Mina, also had the ability to adapt and to capitalise on the new environment and all that it offered in ways that ultimately served the best interests of Jewish life and ensured Jewish continuity. The Jewish world for these people wasn't just an abstract concept to be discussed and debated, to be viewed from afar. It was an intrinsic part of a living, breathing identity, one that was played out every day of their lives. The preservation of the Jewish world was the preservation of who they were, and if that world had to be saved, then they would need to be the ones to save it. It was, as Mina herself recalled late in her life, a matter of life and death. We know that Mina's early life was forged amidst the tumultuous events that shaped the first half of the 20th century, and a time that also marked her by personal tragedy. The most significant factors, therefore, that affected her life and set the course of her life's trajectory did not happen in Melbourne. So to understand the context that so heavily influenced Mina's life choices, we have to go back to where it all began and where she spent the first 19 formative years of her life. Bialystok. In many ways, Bialystok of the late 19th and early 20th century shared the same characteristics as other emerging industrial, textile and manufacturing centres of Eastern Europe, cities that had large Jewish populations replete with the cultural and political life that engendered. But Bialystok was different. It represented the Eastern European Jewish world in all its drama. And Bialystokers in particular were renowned for a strong sense of identity and place in the world, long after they may have left that world behind. I'm not just from Bialystok, I am a Bialystoker, and that means much more. Israel Becker, who was the early director of the Habima Theatre Group in Tel Aviv, was known to proudly proclaim on more than one occasion and regularly. In Melbourne, the Bialystokers were one of the largest and most influential diasporic groups within the newcomer community. They formed strong networks and were leaders in all of the major communal organisations. They established the first Landsmannschaft here in 1928 and set the template for communal organisation and charitable self-help institutions that reached far beyond the Bialystoker network. Bialystok, situated 180 kilometres east of Warsaw, sat on the crossroad of the Russian Empire and the Polish nation. It was a border town, located in a heavily forested region that divided Poland from Belarus and Lithuania. By the time Mina's family were residents within the city, Bialystok was the major bustling transit stop for the railway between St. Petersburg and Warsaw. And by the beginning of the 20th century, nearly 100,000 Jews had migrated to and from the city, including the Finks. Population movements like that ensured that Jewish Bialystok was constantly being exposed to changing, shifting political, social, cultural movements. Bialystok was a politically charged and turbulent city. Its residents learnt to be adaptable and resilient. Its Jewish inhabitants suffered a devastating pogrom in 1906 and continuing sporadic outbursts of anti-Semitic violence. From the time of Mina's birth on the 5th of December 1913 as the second of three children to Frieda and Nathan Wax, until she left in 1932, Bialystok changed political hands 4 times within the first 7 years of Mina's life. Firstly, it was governed by the Russian Empire, and then it came under the harsh German occupation during the First World War. It was given back to the Russian Empire for 1 year following the armistice, and then it was incorporated into the newly established Polish Republic in 1920. In spite of its political turbulence, Bialystok remained a thriving and diverse Jewish centre, and here is another distinction, one of the densest Jewish populations in Eastern Europe. When Mina was still an infant, 75% of the population, 40,000 out of a population of 54,260, was Jewish. Think about it, 75%. Most, like Mina's family, worked in some form or other in the burgeoning textile manufacturing or commercial industries. By 1916, the Jewish population of Bialystok dropped to just under 50% of the total population due to the devastation and flattening of it by the First World War. And the Jewish population remained constant at round the 50% mark until the outbreak of the Second World War. Now, this was a considerable drop, but it was still 50%, 1 in 2 people. Nevertheless, it remained a culturally vibrant Jewish city with a colourful Jewish life at its core. You lived your life from the cradle to the grave within a Jewish world. Mina's family lived in a city of hotly contested ideas, political movements that fired the Jewish imagination with opposing views on how Jewish life should best be lived. Zionism and the Bund, both of which had established strongholds in Bialystok, were well represented in Mina's own family. Mina became a committed Zionist, influenced by her maternal grandfather, Eliezer Kaplan, while her uncle, Jacob Wax, a political activist who was no stranger to the inside of a prison cell, was a renowned leader of the Bund. And we should also remember that the first anarchist group met in Bialystok in 1905, largely made up of Jewish workers. Through necessity, it developed a sprawling network of self-help charitable organisations. It fostered a number of traditional and progressive educational institutions, boasted a spread of cultural, religious organisations, all of which covered the entire spectrum of what the Jewish world had to offer in a microcosm. Notably, women played a significant part in that social, cultural and charitable life of Bialystok. The First World War destroyed Bialystok economically. It also brought financial ruin to Mina's maternal grandparents, the Kaplans. They remained, in the words of Mina's son Nathan, poor but proud. They struggled to keep up appearances, to be respectable and well dressed in public. But there was no money for household expenses. Education was, however, valued. And these values remained with Mina for her entire life. When Mina was 8 years of age, tragedy struck. Her father died of typhus and her mother committed suicide soon after. Late in Mina's life, she confided to her daughter that it was she who found her mother's lifeless body. And as a consequence, Mina suffered another blow when the 3 siblings were split up. She and her younger brother went to live with her Kaplan grandparents, and her older brother was sent to live with the Wax grandparents. One can only imagine the impact of such a tragedy on any young child. Fortuitously, Mina's character possessed considerable fortitude, one that enabled her to build and develop resilience, a quality that she would draw on as the life and the world threw up its challenges. She came to value and understand the strength of extended networks. She didn't have parents to fall back on. It also showed her the importance of forging and maintaining strong extended family ties. She would come to build very close bonds with the large Fink family, as well as her own Wax family. And she kept close relationships with a coterie of friends. And this also gives us an insight into why she took on the care of institutionalised children and orphans on such a personal level and pursued their welfare and education with such dogged determination for the majority of her life. Mina's response to personal tragedy was positive. It was adaptive and it was life-affirming. Mina's formal education also proved to have a lasting impact on her values and sensibilities. It was progressive, it was secular, and it was liberal. A graduate of the famous Druskin Gymnasium, a school that was referred to by another well-known Bialystoker, the late Israel Kippen, as being one of the most highly prestigious schools in Bialystok. The school was founded by a very progressive educator, David Druskin, in 1911. In 1919, the school adopted Polish as the language of instruction. In 1925, offered its first baccalaureate, the matriculation, and in 1926 had 145 students. By the early 1930s, when Mina was in her final years at school, the student number had doubled. Its reputation had spread, and it was recognised as a leading educational provider by the Polish government. But importantly, it was co-educational. Men and women studied the same subjects, the same curriculum, in the same classrooms. Now, this type of education was not the norm. In the interwar period, for any Jew to matriculate in Poland was an achievement, but for a woman, it was exceptional. And being educated together with men would have given Mina a great sense of parity with her male cohort. Mina's education, by its very nature, promoted female empowerment. It would be a cause she would take up with enduring passion throughout her life. Mina matriculated in June of 1932 with a broad range of subjects that included religious education, the Polish language, Latin, French, history, geography, natural sciences, mathematics, art, and physical education. On her certificate of completion, it was all written and graded in Polish, which I translated. Everything that she got was bardzo dobrze. Those of you that know Polish know that means very good, better than satisfactory in all of these subjects. Mina forever valued formal education. In one interview that she recalled how surprised she was that the Australian Jewish women she first met on arrival here in the land of great opportunity were on the whole not highly educated. And one of her lasting regrets was that circumstances had prevented her from pursuing a university education, preferably in Warsaw. In the same year that she graduated, Mina was introduced to a man some 12 years her senior, who was on a trip back to Bialystok from his new home in Melbourne, Australia, to visit family and buy machinery, whose own mother was worried at his bachelor status and undertook to introduce him to a suitable young woman of marriageable age. There's a very long story about this, but you can ask the Finks about it. The rest, as they say, is history. The end result was that Mina met and married the greatest influence on her life, her precious husband and life partner, whom she later described as her colleague, a tribute to their equal status, who always encouraged and supported her involvement in communal affairs. Yitzhak Leib, known as Leo Fink, a man she met and soon after married on the 20th of September 1932, and with whom she sailed to Australia, arriving on the 29th of November that year, travelling third class on board the Orama. All of this happened within the space of a few short months. Mina showed good judgment and considerable courage in accepting the challenges of an unknown life far from the one that she could ever have imagined. By the time Mina was 22 years of age in 1935, she had been orphaned, she'd become a wife to a man she intuitively trusted but didn't know terribly well at the time, journeyed to the furthest corner of the globe as an immigrant, and had become a mother of two. By 1938, Mina's life seemed settled. She'd managed to get her two brothers to join her in Melbourne, and she was in the process of obtaining landing permits for her uncle Jacob Wax and his wife. By the way, it would be Leo who would be the guarantor on those, because women didn't quite have the same financial status, but he did sign lots of guarantees. Now, the Waxes did get here, but not till 1940, and there's another story in that. She was living in relative comfort at 99 Walpole Street, Kew, and was an accepted, loving member of the Fink clan. But she still felt the strong pull of the life that she had left behind. And so, with her children in the care of Jack and Sadie Fink, she decided to accompany Leo to Europe, where she made the trip back into Poland. Now, this was in March of 1938. Do you know what else happened in March of 1938? The Anschluss. So Germany had already established its foothold in Austria. And at that time, she found herself travelling by train through Nazi-controlled Germany, where she later recalled that the blaring voice of Hitler could be heard on the radio, sending shivers down her spine. This side trip, which took up most of March, because she's dated her photographs from then, so we know, was about 3 weeks long, But it was extremely bittersweet, and it left its mark. Later in life, she recalled, members of the family were asking me to obtain landing permits for their 14 and 15-year-olds, and when I returned home, there wasn't enough time to process the permits. The news that war had broken out left me devastated. I had a guilt complex as to why I didn't hurry with the permits. I could have saved a few more lives. We know that with the outbreak of war in 1939, Leo had put his name forward, and he had actually enlisted as a voluntary member of a reserve battalion. And while he didn't see active service, the threat of war was increasingly encroaching on their lives. In 1940, Mina put herself forward to be trained by the St John's Ambulance Service, where she successfully completed 3 courses to render first aid to the injured, to be an air raid warden, and to be able to render nursing assistance in the home. For Mina, it was important to be able to not only give assistance, but to be qualified to do so. Correct procedures and professionalism were always important to Mina. News of the mass murders was filtering through to Melbourne, and we know that it was increasingly difficult to garner news of family or friends, while newspapers published horrific accounts of the Jewish slaughter in Europe. Jews living here, like Mina and Leo, who had left family and friends over there, often felt helpless, yet deeply committed to providing aid and assistance. So what could they do? Well, they did what they've always done in times of crisis. They rallied, they grouped together, and they used all means available through their extensive Jewish networks, here and abroad. And remember, as I said, this was a very interconnected Jewish world. They contacted the American Joint Distribution Committee, the HIAS, which was the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, the World Jewish Congress, OSE, to be able to render assistance with funds and goods going directly into Europe. They negotiated with the Australian government for shipping rights, not an easy thing to do when the country was on a war footing with its own rationing and its other restrictions. From 1943 on, at the age of 30, Mina became an indefatigable member of the relief and rescue organisations that were spearheaded by her husband, who had put her name forward to help organise a ladies' group. Leo knew what Mina was capable of. And don't be misled by the soft term ladies' group. These women, who Mina later referred to as my army, formed the backbone of a strategic, well-organised, highly disciplined organisation, one that she bragged about in the 1970s, had its own democratic elections and secret ballots, and she reminded people as early as 1943. They used methods that they knew well and that they could massage and manipulate. They had paid membership drives, clothing collections, food parcels, fundraising functions. They used every means of entertainment and every source they could as the core way of eliciting funds. They staged concerts, plays, balls, fairs, raffles, and at Mina's suggestion, family simchas also became a place and time for fundraising. They launched well-directed public relations programs in the Jewish press to raise awareness of the importance of their work to the war effort. From the 4th of October 1944, Mina was president of this ladies' group and the only female member of the United Jewish Overseas Relief Fund executive, commanding an organisation of 900 female members, staffing 2 large warehouses and workrooms where clothing was sorted, cleaned and packed. They knitted clothing for children. They stacked prepared for shipping tons and tons of tinned food and bottled jams, sheepskins, blankets. They coordinated numerous subgroups that covered every suburb in which Jews lived. Mina ensured that everything that was packed and sorted was in good condition. She upheld that charity with dignity was important, that those receiving handouts should be treated with respect and not condescension. In one set of minutes, she commented on the huge task that they confronted, and she looked around at her male cohorts and urged them that men too could join in these workrooms. By 1945, the work of these organisations swiftly turned from relief to rescue, and in the post-war immigration period from 1946 to 54, which saw the Melbourne Jewish community more than double its size. Mina's work focused on resettlement and rehabilitation. She specifically, and it's recorded in the minutes, asked the Australian Jewish Welfare and Relief Society, which is a complicated story. It was the merging of two bodies, the United Jewish Overseas Relief Fund and the Jewish Welfare, both of which at this time were already under the direction of Leo, simultaneously. She asked this organisation executive what the ladies' group should do. She was given direction. More importantly, she was given authority. She was put in charge of the House Committee, oversaw the facilities and the hostels that accommodated new arrivals, met boats at the wharf, personally directed cars and drivers to take these arrivals to their destination. She negotiated with custom officials, often acting as an interpreter, organised welcoming functions, entertainment for those that were in transit to other cities. And she took a long-term interest in the children, housed at the Lorino Children's Home, later to be renamed the Francis Barkman Home. Mina operated at all levels, and it wasn't uncommon to see her take up a broom to sweep the floor at one of the hostels. Oh, I can see you laughing, this is true. And reorganise the kitchen. Although she was meticulous in her personal grooming and had impeccable dress sense, nevertheless, she saw no task as too great or too small. And if there's a lesson in this, it's that leadership leads by example. And if that meant getting your hands dirty to get the job done, then so be it. And that certainly held true for Mina. Throughout the 1950s, professional social workers began filling the role previously undertaken by volunteers. Now, Mina did not resent this at all. On the contrary, she welcomed the professionalisation of services. She always was able to move with the times. She could see the lie of the land. She was often, as they said, ahead of the curve. She understood, she encouraged, she embraced change and renewal as important factors for the survival of all organisations. It was a recurring theme in her life. But that didn't mean a withdrawal from Jewish welfare. She remained a director of the Welfare Board until 1977, again, one of only a handful of women to do so, and a great contributor to its planning and organisation. We know she took this role seriously because her copy of the minutes and correspondence is replete with her handwritten notes scratched all over them, commenting and prompting a response, often like, "I did not say that," underlined. Always were well considered and very insightful. Her influence with Jewish welfare continued long after she'd left the board, and as late as 1987, she was asked to be and accepted the role of chairman. Note, it was still the masculine. They didn't have chairperson or chairwoman. She was chairman of the Australian Jewish Welfare Appeal. As was mentioned by Miriam, from 1957 to 1960, Mina had stepped up to a new role, and she was greatly supported in doing this by Leo. As president of the National Council of Jewish Women Victoria, an organisation she had actually joined with Anya Kasten in 1946. Mina was the first East European woman to hold the presidency of the Victorian section, and increasingly she saw that the role of women's groups were not merely adjuncts to the tasks of men, but they were a demonstration of women's independence and their right to run their own organisations. As national president from 1967 to 73, she did expand the vision and the reach of the National Council of Jewish Women, and she did incorporate a new women's movement into its work. Mina was the born and bred feminist, but she'd found a new voice as the head of a women's organisation in need of an ideological makeover. Mina had inherited a national council that was steeped in its three-point platform of national work for Israel and state work for local Jewish causes and state work for non-Jewish causes. Now, Mina didn't abandon these ideals, and in her first editorial in the council bulletin as the national president, she called for a continued commitment to Israel, the community and humanity. But the focus would increasingly shift to women's affairs and the international scene. When the National Council of Jewish Women Australia undertook the building of a hall of residence for women at the University of Papua New Guinea so that women from all over the country could continue their education. It was Mina who mobilised the National Council to assist with the necessary fundraising. And when the Russian Jew Ida Nudel unsuccessfully applied for a visa to leave the Soviet Union for Israel, resulting in her imprisonment, it was Mina who led a protest delegation of National Council of Jewish Women to the Russian embassy in Canberra. And as a result of her attendance at the international conventions of the International Council of Jewish Women in 1954, 1963, 66 and 69, Mina initiated large-scale projects that really put the National Council on the map. And although she was no longer president of National Council in 1975, Mina went on to chair the international convention held in Melbourne that year, the first ever international Jewish meeting to be held in Australia by any Jewish organisation. In that same year, the Women's Day wrote an article about women's organisations around the world that had been quietly activists and advocates for the empowerment and advancement of women long before women's liberation had even been spoken of. It singled out 6 women, one of whom was Mina Fink. Mina was greatly influenced by the methodology and energy of the American National Council of Jewish Women. She was impressed with the number and calibre of highly educated younger women who took on leadership roles. And consequently, Mina sought to actively recruit young, educated women from her daughter's generation. This new generation of highly educated women also ensured that the National Council of Jewish Women retained a global vision. It strengthened its activism on behalf of women around the world with a renewed interest in world Jewish affairs and global campaigns. On a local level, it energised the organisation with a new form of professionalism in the way that meetings were run and the funds were raised. Mina was recognised for her great contributions to the International Council of Jewish Women with an honorary executive life membership in 1987. Mina's great strength was that she could recruit and inspire exceptional women from all walks of life to work with her. Sylvia Gelman and Malvina Malinek helped her to build an organisation that would go on to continually attract a younger generation of women. The National Council in the 1970s was both feminist in tone and action, but it was also an organisation that was built now for continual renewal. Now, Mina didn't see the role of women as taking over from men, but rather, in her own words, to extend their influence and to empower women. She didn't want to diminish or weaken the family structure. She still believed that a central role of women was as the arbiters of family life. Mina was awarded an MBE Member of the British Empire in 1974 in recognition of her community service and in particular to Jewish women. This honour meant a lot to Mina, who valued recognition for effort rendered and who enjoyed the high profile that came with a public life. Not to be confused with popularity. It was, as her son Nathan recalled in a public address he gave in 2002, respectability. That was very important to her. She liked to be invited to Government House, to the Royal Ball, to be introduced to prime ministers, ambassadors and governors. The Finks thought that was all nonsense, is his words, not mine. But to her, it spelt recognition. Leo and Mina travelled frequently and both were lifelong supporters of Israel. Their many visits included prolonged stays between 1960 and 1964, while Leo was establishing a business venture in Ashdod. Again, Mina didn't remain idle. She attended an ulpan and spent time with relatives and friends building on her considerable networks. She remained a passionate supporter of Israel all her life, assisting with the United Israel Appeal, and was an executive member of the Zionist Federation of Australia for almost 2 decades. It was in Israel that it is said that she spent some of her happiest times. In the last 10 years of Mina's life, she assisted in the establishment of the Jewish Holocaust and Research Centre, which opened in Melbourne in 1984. At her request and in recognition of her financial support, the museum building was named in honour of Leo, who had died in 1972. Perhaps her greatest contribution was the vision that she brought to that enterprise and a healthy dose of organisational and procedural expertise. She insisted that meetings were recorded accurately and records kept. One report told me she threatened to stand up and walk out if they didn't actually decide to keep minutes and records. I could just imagine some of those meetings. Sometimes you wish you had a time capsule, didn't you? But most importantly, she did not want the museum to remain a static, ossified memorial. She saw to it that the museum's mandate included a forward-thinking, progressive educational program. She worked to provide proper training for survivors who were guides to visiting school groups, and she was a strong advocate for a public lecture program and the involvement of academics, all of which remain a fundamental part of the museum and its success to this day. Mina's greatest legacy was her unswerving commitment to ensuring the longevity of all the organisations she led, that they would continue long after she was no longer at the helm. This centred on her belief that they could only survive if they remained relevant, addressing the needs of the times. That meant being receptive to change, being resilient and adaptable, traits that were reflected in Mina herself. Her management of people was exemplary. She would recruit and inspire volunteers to work with her. She would put protégés into positions of responsibility and guide them, and she always encouraged and fostered talent. The late Saba Feniger, who was the Holocaust Museum's first curator, recalled some years ago that it was Mina who inspired her to do her work. Knowing that I had Mina's backing, she said, I was encouraged to go on and to undertake a variety of commitments which I might otherwise not have been game enough to do. Rabbi Jonathan Sachs says of leadership that to be a leader you don't need a crown or robes of office. All you need to do is to write your chapter in the story. Do deeds that heal some of the pain of this world and act so that others become a little better for having known you. In that light, perhaps the finest testament to Mina's legacy comes from one of her own Buchenwald boys, Max Silberman, who recalled, "We knew that she was an important member of our community who held a lot of high positions, but to us, she was a fine human being, greatly loved and cherished." Thank you.
Thank you so much, Margaret. You're back. That was really insightful. I'm sure everyone would agree. We're going to get into some questions and answers. Does anyone have any questions yet? We've got some roving microphones. Leanne, we've got one in front of you.
Hi. Well, Vina Malinek, you just mentioned me.
Why not?
I just have to say something, because last weekend there's an exhibition at the Melbourne Museum right now, which is entitled Revolution. My daughter and I went there, and I happened to mention to her, and I said, I'm so disappointed. And Mina, if she would be here, she would be so disappointed with me, together with me, I mean, that 50 years down the track, as women, first of all, nothing much has changed. We're still worrying about the abortion or reforms and all the issues. And there's still gender wars and violence and all the rest of it. She would be so disappointed. And as Jews, we would be equally disappointed in a way, because when she tapped me on the shoulder to be her honorary secretary and national president, I had run for the young group a forum, some sort of a function, I can't remember exactly, but I could repeat it today. It was dealing with anti-Semitism. We could be setting up exactly the same thing today, 50 years down the track. But something she would be very, very proud of, and that's her family. Her family, she was always passionate about family, everybody's family, but to know and Israel. So the two things combined, and knowing that Frida's son is now the ambassador in London for Israel, I think that she would have been quelling with nachas. So she was proud of all her children, grandchildren, but today to see where Israel is, although the wars that we went through and all the passions that we had to go through, the 6-Day War and the 73 War and all the other issues that we had, nothing has changed. There's still no peace. But Israel is thriving. She would take a lot of pride in that. And, of course, having her own family so involved, she would be very proud.
Thank you. Any other questions? Any other questions? Yes.
There seemed to be so much primary evidence that you were able to draw on, and obviously is informing your work now, or maybe not. Yeah. What did you find? I think the pictures of her time in Europe just before the war would have been amazing as well. What was the most fascinating primary evidence that you found?
There are a lot of gaps that I've still got to fill in because the research is in its early stages. There is a lot about the public life, the minutes and everything. The early life, what I found very interesting were the things that Mina kept. And the things that she kept were obviously the things that were very important. Every certificate from school is there. So I knew exactly what she'd studied. I knew exactly what her qualification was. I knew exactly what grades she got. The photographs when she got engaged to Leo, and she has her arms draped around Leo's parents. Now, she's the one that's physically very demonstrative, and she has her arms around them. And it was, I think Frida said it was their engagement party. And things like that tell me a little bit about her reaching out, her acceptance of this. This was a man that she just got introduced to, you know. And then she agrees to marry him, and then she agrees to leave. Now, I don't know, but I suspect she'd never been outside of Poland in her life. So this was an enormous step for her, and she didn't speak English. And in fact, she was always a bit concerned that her English wasn't good enough. But my evidence of what she has written herself and what when I've heard her quoted, her English became very good, which is characteristic often of people who was actually very good in another language. And she would have been very good in Polish, and she would have probably been good in her Yiddish as well. So I found those things were very interesting. But the thing that really makes it interesting is when I get something like a photograph of Mina in 1938 walking down the streets in Białystok with a beautiful hat and a coat and boots, and she's got her arms linked into her obviously very good friends or family. She's walking down the main street. This is March 1938. Now, I know that historically the Anschluss is happening and has happened. Austria's been swallowed up by the Third Reich. She's there for 3 weeks and she gets out. And she goes back. Now, Frida, you told me that Leo didn't actually go back into Białystok with her. So she travelled by herself by train through Germany at this time to get back into Poland and then through into Białystok, which was on the east. So when you start to build a context and you put things together and you see what happens at that time, it really gives you a broader understanding of the person and what they were doing and how they did it. So the sort of archival things, the photographs are very revealing. Some of the early and of course, the fact that she kept the 3 certificates from the St John's ambulance, that this she did in 1940, was very interesting because when I again go to look at Melbourne during the war years, and there's been a lot of really good work that's been done on that. The Manpower Act, that didn't come in until 1942. You know, Australia. You had the fall of Singapore, then you had the bombing of Darwin on the 19th of February 1942. After that, they started really pushing for the Women's Land Army and to set up plans for evacuation and the possibility of civilian major evacuation because they really did fear a land invasion. Mm-hmm. Mina had already, 2 years earlier, undertaken an ambulance course. Now, that just shows me again that she was kind of anticipating what she could do and where she could go with her ability and her talent. Here she was at least she was lucky she didn't have to go and work. A lot of the women, when the men went off to fight, they had to go and, and work. But she was in a position where she could contribute a lot. So things like finding those certificates mean a lot, because when you start to put everything together, you can see the bigger picture of why she did things and how she did them. So those kind of things are very interesting. I would like to know, and I will try to talk a little bit more about what the family did in Bialystok during that early time, because I think they were very formative years for her. I mean, her education, I could find out lots about the Druskina Gymnasium, why it was so extraordinary, why her education was so extraordinary, and what that did for her. So those kind of things were very, very interesting, I think. And then, of course, I'm looking at putting it together with Leo. And, of course, he's a Bialystoker too, so I didn't go into Leo. But, so there's an interesting nexus there.
Any additional questions?
Mine's a really basic question. Did the food parcels make it?
Oh, yes. There's a whole story to how they had to do that. The American Joint was highly organised. They had depots in Jerusalem and in Tehran. And they were able to ship things to certain spots, because it wasn't just about raising money and sending money, because there were no goods to buy. So there was a mixture of sending money, which they did an extraordinary amount. They sent money, but they also had to send goods. Now, they couldn't send all goods. They weren't allowed to send powdered milk, because that was under restrictions. So they could only send the things that they were allowed to send. Now, one of the interesting things was that Leo gets a letter from the chief rabbi in London requesting kosher meat. He sent 1,500 pounds or something worth of actual frozen kosher meat. Now, he worked with the Smorgans to get that. They were the butchers, you see. He had very good relationships with the Smorgans. So they were extremely helpful in that. So it's been recorded, yes, they did get all the shipping. They went through, and then there was another issue where the United Nations, Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, UNRWA, which was established in 1943, the Melbourne organisations, particularly Leo and his whole cohort, wanted to send a medical relief mission with them. And they did, but it took them 2 years to get it. And they were stationed in Greece. So as each pocket of Europe became liberated, places like UNRWA would enter, places like the Joint would enter, HIAS would enter. You've got to remember that Europe was liberated over 1 year. It took a year. So from August 1944, Paris was already liberated. So the HIAS and the Joint could go and start operating in Paris. The Russian government, interestingly enough, whenever they liberated areas, did allow foodstuffs and things to come into relief centres and organisations. So surprisingly, they did get these goods through. But it was a minefield of negotiation, and they had to negotiate with the Australian government to get shipping rights, and it was a Herculean effort by a very small actual number of people. And there's a history in that too.
Mm. Anyone else?
I was wondering what you think the biggest inspirational lesson that modern Jewish women can take from Mina's life. There was a lot of inspiring things that she did, but is there one thing that stands out to you?
I think it's to be able... Oh, sorry. Well, I think that initially she worked within the men's groups, and she worked within them but developed her own voice. And I think she had her own voice. I mean, one of the things that Rebecca was talking about was the women in the shadows. And I don't think that Mina was ever in the shadows, actually. So she's a little bit atypical to what you're perhaps referring to. And she wasn't in the shadows because she had a very good support network, and she also had a husband who was her great enabler. But the lesson for today is, I think, that she had a very positive and life-affirming attitude, and that she liked to empower women. Later in her life, it was about renewal and empowerment of women and being able to move forward in that way. And I think that she was perhaps a little bit atypical for her time, and to be, I think, adaptable and resilient, to build resilience. I mean, resilience is a bit of a buzzword these days. I talk about, teaching kids to be resilient and that. But I think that she had that, and the life lessons that she had early on actually taught her. And she was life-affirming. She didn't allow that to sort of hold her back. Go on, Frida.
Yes, I just wanted to say that she actually belonged to another group before the
relief organisation.
Yes, was established in the very early war time period when I was very young. She joined an organisation which was raising money by all the local allied communities. So the French, the local, that wasn't Jewish. And I think it was all organised by women.
Mm-hmm.
So I think she had an experience of this before she got involved with the Jewish community activities. There was a French committee, there was a Chinese committee, all the allied communities that were allies in the war. They were raising money for the war effort.
That's right.
And I was sent to around our street to collect money for this cause by another neighbour who was in the French committee. And then they had a Queen competition, like the Jewish community did later on for the Zionist movement. Had like our current Queen, and I was the attendant to the Polish Queen. My mother was. I was dressed up in a Polish national costume with a. And there was a Jewish boy who was the male attendant, and I was the female attendant to the Queen. And the Queen candidate for the Polish community here was Halinka Dertachinska, who later on became a famous opera singer here, right? But it wasn't a Jewish organisation, this particular thing. Now, this was in the very early 40s, because the war started in 39.
Yes.
I think I was about 9 or something. Maybe it was 42. When was this organisation
Well, it started off before 43, because in 42 there was already the United Emergency Committee, and that was taken over. So that there were a whole lot of precursors. Okay, to the United Jewish Overseas Relief Fund was established as the United Relief Fund, and then it became the United Overseas Relief Fund. I mean, to try to track all of these things, and there was an emergency appeal and an emergency committee group, which Leo actually took over and made that the United Overseas Relief Fund, and then he took over the Jewish Welfare Society. And she was already involved very early on, right from the beginning, but it was 43 for the United Jewish Overseas Relief Fund, that when they were officially established, but I think the work started before then. You've got to say 42 was a terrible year in the war. I mean, 1940, Australia was already committed to the war from right day one, but in 42 there was the threat of a possibility of a land invasion because of the attack at Darwin, and America was already in the war. And Melbourne was the main centre for the Americans at that time. They were coming, immediately they came to Melbourne.
I wonder whether, thanks for such a terrific talk. I'm over here.
Oh, thanks, Colin.
Just make this the last question.
Yeah, okay. I just wonder if you could say something about the important role that Mina and Leo played in negotiating with Calwell and the Labor government after the war to enable the relatively large migration of Jews to come to Australia. Can you speak about? I think it's a really critical part of her story.
Yeah, it is. It was mostly Leo who worked in that, and because the focus of the talk for me tonight was Mina's legacy and Mina, so I didn't kind of get into the actual political situation of negotiation. And it wasn't just Leo, that, of course, that did this negotiation, and there was a whole lot of... Calwell is an ambiguous and interesting character. We've got Andrew Marcus here, and he could probably answer you better on that. Right, Andrew? No, he says. He's off duty today. But there was a lot of negotiation, and Calwell kind of changed his political mind every now and then because he was a political operator. But initially there was the humanitarian visa group, which allowed the 2,000 people to come into Australia. And that was Alec Maisel, who went with Paul Morowitz and had a private meeting with Arthur Calwell. Yeah. Yep. Okay. Well, there was the way that you could come into Australia. Let me begin by saying the Australian government did not pay for Jewish immigration, right? There were lots of programs where there were arrangements made with other countries to boost the immigration. And Australia was on a big immigration push, right? Populate or perish and all of that. And there were a lot of different programs that were initiated, and there was an International Refugee Organisation program. And Jews were initially excluded from that, and then there was only about 15% that they would allow later on, and there was a lot of difficulties. And they didn't want to be overrun with Jewish immigrants. That was the fear. And Leo had a particular way of dealing with issues, which was act first and apologise later. And the Sydney Office of Welfare, which was run at the time by Saul Simons, had a very different perspective, which was don't go over my head, work with me, I'm the mouthpiece of the Jewish community. And he said there was a very interesting letter that Leo wrote, which kind of gives you an idea of what propelled him, because he was on the first commercial flight. I'm getting into Leo now, but he was on the first commercial flight to Europe in February of 1946 and went to Paris to negotiate with the Hayas, because he wanted to actually bring out, and the sponsorship issue was that they could get landing permits, but they couldn't get onto boats, which was one of the problems. Then there were too many coming, so the government put a 25% embargo on no more than 25% Jews on any boat or any plane or any way that they get here. And one of the boats that was leaving, the Johann de Witt, which was one of the first boats that came, had more than 25%. It was a considerable number of Jews that arrived at that time. Leo went and negotiated with Arthur Calwell personally to allow the boat to land. He went to Canberra, he negotiated with, he got the okay. And then what happened was that there was, Arthur Calwell, of course, said yes to him and then wrote a scathing letter to Simons and saying, you know, what's going on here? And we made a deal and you're not holding to the bargain. And Simons then wrote an abusive letter to Leo, and Leo wrote back and said, well, if you'd been in Paris in May of 1946 and seen those destitute survivors standing on the doorsteps of the Hayas with a landing permit in their hand and they couldn't get on a boat, then you would have acted like I did and not sat there waiting for bureaucracy to say yes. So that was kind of, the big thing. How did they get here? They could get here by being guarantors privately. That is, immigrants could come if they were privately guaranteed by an individual or a Landsmannschaft or a corporate type of sponsorship by Jewish welfare. And they negotiated that would be the case. Now, to pay for a lot of that once they were here, they had to be guaranteed that they wouldn't be a burden on the state. So they had to be housed, they had to be employed. And Leo was one of the ones that acted as a personal guarantee. And, the famous comment that Arthur Calwell made at a dinner, I never knew a man who had so many cousins. And, of course, the other one that acted in this way was Jacob Wax, who used to walk around throughout Carlton with blank forms, and he'd go into everybody's house and he would ask them to sign as a guarantor to people. And he got involved with the immigration officers at the time when he submitted the forms, and they said, what are you talking about? Everyone's these cousins. He said, we're all related. You try to prove we're not. We are all cousins. And of course, the late Jonas Pushett, who worked with Leo indefatigably, had so many was a sponsor to so many people that he got a letter from the immigration authorities that said to him, because I got this from his son when he was still alive, he said, we've noticed that you have over 60 people living in your house and we actually think that that's enough for now. And Yankel Pushett said, we were always going down to the wharfs and sort of meeting people. But Leo and Mina did act as personal guarantors for I don't know how many people. And in fact, they acted as guarantors for some that weren't Jewish, but who were desperate. There was an Italian couple. I've got the landing permits that you gave me. And they guaranteed, because Leo would write down that they would be employed at the Fink, the woolen mills. Because if they could guarantee employment and where they would live, that was the big, the government was very concerned about, because there was a housing shortage and, all of that. So they did negotiate, he negotiated, and Morris Ashkenazi was the one who really gave a gentleman's agreement that if they lifted the 25%, that there would never be more than 3,000 Jews arrive in any 1 year. And there wasn't. If you actually look at the immigration records, there wasn't. So while Leo was certainly, he was a personal guarantee, and he certainly directed welfare to act as a corporate guarantee or guarantor. It was a whole, it was a political exercise.
I'm going to have to stop you there, Margaret, unfortunately. There's so many more stories, I'm sure.
I'm sorry, I sort of got into Leo because I was asked specifically, and I spoke mostly about
I'm getting the nod.
We just want to say thank you. Sorry, can I have a moment?
You can.
Hello. Hi. I'm Anna Seri. I'm on the board of National Council, and I just wanted to say thank you to both of you. I thought that was a fascinating and really quite beautiful night of storytelling, so thank you. I was standing at the back and was able to see the whole room was really captivated, so thank you. Rebecca, your passion and interest in telling a story is so evident, and we thank you for talking to us tonight, and also for bringing that same devotion to story in your journalism at the Jewish News. I've had a little bit to do with you recently, and I can say that your commitment to women's stories in particular is really something for which we all should be grateful. So thank you. We have a little gift for you. Beautiful. Thank you. Sorry, you have to hold that. Can you hold that? And Dr Taft, your presentation tonight reminds us all of the power of storytelling, not only for our history but for our future. Thank you for shining a light on the esteemed Mina Fink with sensitivity and such rich and deep insight, ensuring that her story and her voice remains an enduring inspiration for all of us. As a beneficiary of the work of some of our feminist forebears, I think it's really important to be reminded just how remarkable achievements like Mina's really were. So thank you again to you for your time.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. That is beautiful. Just a few more minutes. I've just lost my ads. The thread tonight of making women's voices heard is particularly relevant to us at National Council. We believe that the voices, experiences and perceptions of women should be elevated and celebrated, and we believe that women should enjoy the same access to and opportunities enjoyed by men in communal leadership, in decision-making, in community panels and in events. So we are working on a campaign. It's called Make Space for Her, and it aims to ensure that Jewish women in Victoria are equally represented in leadership positions and at community events. A formal launch of this campaign is forthcoming, and we are really excited to share those details with you in the coming weeks. In encouraging women to stand up and speak up, we look to women like Mina Fink and both of you as inspiration and as role models. The women and young girls of our community can't be what they can't see, and so tonight we thank you for playing an integral part of the journey to making women's voices heard loudly and widely. Thank you. And just a few quick ads. We're running our end of financial year campaign. Some of you may have received this card or an email. We encourage you to think about some of the work that we're doing and dig a little deeply. And you can make your donations online, fill out the cards and leave them at the front. Brain Food returns next week, Thursday the 25th of June at 7:30. We have Tuesday, sorry. The session is going to be a really informal talk, fascinating, by three women, a Jew, a Muslim and a Christian, who travelled to Jerusalem together to visit each other's holy sites and share their perspectives. So you can come and hear about their experiences and their insights, and you can make bookings online via the website. And finally, we just would like to invite all of the family up to the front to have a few photos. Thank you. And a cup of tea down the other end. Thank you.